Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, an overview of RadSite's remote scanning standards. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded and available through our website. To minimize noise and distraction, all attendees' mics have been muted. However, if you have a question or comment during the presentation, we encourage you to submit it using your Q&A box. We'll do our best to address all questions and comments. I will now turn the presentation over to our moderator, Dr. Eliot Siegel, RadSite's Standards Committee Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate this session. The idea in general of remote scanning for technologists is something that has not really been written that much about or talked that much about in general, and it's a really exciting area. I know there are quite a few sites that have been doing remote scanning, and it's been fascinating to learn from those sites. I first became aware of the idea of remote scanning in an article that was presented at the RSNA meeting that talked about the efficacy of having an expert technologist that was essentially providing assistance to another technologist who was on site, and the potential to add subspecialty or increase the efficacy of the scanning, safety of the scanning, particularly for challenging scans, was really amazing. And the whole idea since then of being able to enlarge on that and to be able to take advantage of some of that technology for today's environment, where over 80% of radiology departments have indicated that they suffer from staff shortages. So I'm really excited about the topic, and wanted to let Dr. Mark Hiatt and Garry Carneal introduce themselves. So Mark, you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Siegel. My name is Mark Hiatt. I'm a radiologist myself. I've served previously as a medical benefit management leader, as well as a health plan payer. And I'm currently serving as the Chief Medical Officer for RadSite, for which I also serve as the Vice Chair of its Standards Committee. And what may be pertinent to this discussion is I've also served for a state's medical education council concerned about shortages and staffing of healthcare providers. And secondly, as the chair of a state's Digital Health Service Commission concerned about remote and digital means of providing healthcare. And Dr. Siegel mentioned his experience in first learning about remote imaging. Mine was as a medical student when funded by the Albert Schweitzer Foundation. I sought to deliver subspecialized interpretive ability to rural regions of the nation through teleradiology. And so this, I think, has been a long time in coming, and I think we're finally seeing the fruition of many years of work and research, such that now we're at a point where it's really important to understand remote scanning and also to impose standards to ensure its safety and quality.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Hiatt. And I'm really looking forward to the perspective of those many hats that you wear and the experience you've had. So thanks so much for joining us as an expert panelist. Garry?
Well, thank you, Dr. Siegel. So my name is Garry Carneal, and I'm the president and CEO of RadSite. I've had the privilege of being in that position for, I think, about 14 years. And when we do launch this remote scanning accreditation program, I'm excited. It's a milestone for me. It's my 30th accreditation program. But going back to the start of my career, I spent more time in the managed care space. Among other positions, I was legislative counsel to the National Association of Insurance Commissioners and developed a lot of the model managed care laws addressing utilization management, credentialing earlier in my career. But in more recent years, I've had the chance to really focus on accreditation. In fact, the very first accreditation program I helped bring to market was one for PPOs back in the mid-1990s, before anybody knew what a PPO was. And more recently, which I'll make some comments later, I was hired by the American Telemedicine Association and had the privilege to develop the preeminent standards for telemedicine accreditation. And I think there's some parallels there, obviously, with what I did with the ATA, with what we're talking about today in remote scanning. So looking forward to participating, Dr. Siegel. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great background. And I think that it'll be really interesting to explore some of the policy regulatory issues and your background as an expert in telemedicine and looking at, how we could potentially look at this as a subset of telemedicine practice will be fascinating. And so, Garry, you want to talk about, you mentioned accreditation. Can you talk about the 6 accreditation programs that are offered by RadSite?
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, RadSite was established as a program for a radiology management firm back in 2005. And as part of kind of the initial version of RadSite as a program, they had developed a certification program for both high-tech and low-tech imaging systems to work with a number of payers as part of the credentialing process. So actually, RadSite started with the baseline of actually accrediting or certifying over 25,000 locations and about 60,000 pieces of equipment, which actually gives us a very strong foundation. I was brought in 2010 to take RadSite and make it its own company and to really work on development of standards for advanced diagnostic imaging and get the MIPA recognition from CMS. So in 2010, we did become a completely separate organization run by a board and committee system. And in 2013, CMS recognized us for the CT, MRI, and nuke med imaging systems. So we today have 5 accreditation programs related to advanced diagnostic imaging, 1 for CT, 1 for MRI, and 1 for nuclear medicine, and 2 more for dental cone beam CT and medical cone beam CT. One of the things I love about RadSite is we're also a research-based organization. So for example, we work with the National Alliance for Healthcare Purchasing Coalitions, which is a payer organization, and really teaching payers and sharing with payers kind of where we think there's opportunities for clinical improvement and quality. And then, for example, more recently, we partnered with the RSNA to help them beta test one of their quantitative image biomarkers, which was really interesting. So I love that tradition. So I think what you'll hear today is that RadSite is really bringing to market the first comprehensive set of standards that deal with all the different aspects of remote scanning. So and we'll explain a little bit more of the process. We're hoping to launch this later this year or in January. Thanks, Dr. Siegel.
Sure. And Garry, you mentioned that RadSite offers those 6 accreditation programs, including medical and dental, cone beam, and nuclear medicine. But the remote standard or the remote accreditation program or the remote scanning accreditation program is specifically for CT and MRI. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we'll talk more about that.
So I think with this introduction, it's really important to realize that the remote scanning train has arrived, essentially. And what I mean by that is the fact that there are quite a few national outpatient groups in particular that have really embraced remote scanning. And so it's been going on for quite a few years, and the practice of remote scanning has proliferated and is continuing to advance. And so in order to meet that, a number of the largest vendors are actually offering systems and offering the technology to enable MRI and CT scanners to essentially do remote scanning. And some people are creating some of their own personalized custom solutions also. And so it's really interesting to see that effort proliferating in outpatient and to some extent inpatient imaging. I think most likely it's been driven by the relative shortage of technologists, but I think there are a number of drivers for it. And so there are quite a few trends with regard to remote scanning. And so Dr. Hiatt, you want to talk a little bit about what some of those trends are, and we can go into that based on your experience and what you've seen.
Sure. And of course, here it's important to say that scanning is all about the people, right? The patients scanned, and then secondly, the professionals who scan them. And as relating first to patients, the overriding concerns with respect to remote scanning is first to assure safety and quality. And secondly, to improve access and convenience of patients accessing these important scans. But as pertaining to the second subset of people, involved in this process of scanning, the people who scan, the technologists, Dr. Siegel, you alluded to the fact that there's a very real concern currently about the technologist shortage. There's, throughout the nation, there's just this concern about having adequate personnel sufficiently experienced to perform these increasingly esoteric and specialized scans. And here, of course, I'm referring to the realm of CT and MRI. Well, a solution would be to leverage our more experienced technologists. And secondly, to make the technologists we have more efficient. And I really think that these trends with respect to people, both patients and professionals, synchronize with a lot of other external factors. And that includes the technological advancements that Dr. Siegel, you alluded to. But secondly, to the rise of telemedicine and its increasing acceptance from the times when I first researched it as a medical student to decades later in the current day where we're actually using teleradiology. And third, I think that there's a greater acceptance of these remote and digital means of providing healthcare because of our recent experience with COVID. We went through a whole multi-year experience in which a lot of things in our nation, in our world, were done virtually. And so I think these are some of the trends that are really giving the impetus to our being concerned about remote scanning being done properly.
Yeah, and the trend for technologists, I think, is parallel the trend for radiologists to increasingly do image interpretation remotely outside of an inpatient or outpatient imaging facility itself. It seems to me that there's a couple of issues with regard to the technologists. One, as you alluded to, is the shortage of the absolute number of technologists. The other is the relative shortage of experienced or expert technologists. And so, I think there's really two things that remote scanning can bring. One is technologists who are more experienced helping those that are less experienced. There's also technologists in one modality being able to help out technologists in another modality. And then there's the potential for non-technologists to be leveraged to help with that overall shortage of numbers of technologists, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that you bring up a good point about also the training of, younger technologists.
Mm-hmm.
Remote scanning provides that means of leveraging expertise that may not necessarily be confined to a particular geographic site. I mean, it could be that you don't have that expertise in cardiovascular imaging through MRI in a particular city. You may need to go to a different city where you have your most experienced technologist who can provide that support and that training to a younger technologist.
From my experience as the head of an imaging department, one of the challenges that so many of us are having recently is keeping up with the volume, particularly CT and MR. How about remote scanning from an operational efficiency perspective?
Well, if you're able to centralize that supervision, very feasibly, an experienced technologist can provide oversight for potentially for multiple scans concurrently. And so there's definitely an advantage to the potential increase in operational efficiency of having one supervisor dedicating his or her time to multiple scans when feasible. Of course, there needs to be certain, appropriate limitations,
Mm-hmm.
but that does afford the opportunity for efficiency.
Excellent. Any other scanning trends that you'd like to talk about?
I just think that really it's the impetus of the recent COVID crisis that
Mm-hmm.
really puts patients and professionals in that mindset that, virtual means may offer their own advantages. Of course, there are disadvantages, but there are definitely advantages to doing things remotely in terms of efficiency, in terms of tapping into expertise wherever it may be found, not necessarily at your site or in your city.
Thanks. And Garry, RadSite is doing a survey currently looking into those remote scanning trends. And I know there was a survey in June from ASRT. Also, we've been seeing FDA clearance of some of the technologies for remote scanning. Would you care to comment on the RadSite survey, what we've learned from
Yes,
the SRT survey?
yeah, so we're focusing, obviously, our accreditation base is mostly outpatient imaging suppliers. So we're really going to try to create a convenient sample of that and better understand the trends. As we mentioned before, we kind of as our market share has grown, we inherited a lot of existing accredited companies that are already doing remote scanning, and you'll hear in a minute, that's why we started developing our policy in 2020. But to me, it's exciting to obviously want to coordinate with the technologists, professional associations, including ASRT, AART, HRA, all now they're beginning to do real work on this. On the ASRT paper, which I encourage people to download, they are promoting, because of the tech shortage, these new positions called the imaging medical aid, limited X-ray machine operator. So that's very helpful. And of course, RadSite's on the business of creating certification standards. We'll recognize the certification standards as they emerge. As you'll hear in a minute, we've tried to kind of backfill some of it where there's regulatory gaps or gaps in terms of the professional standards. So I do think we're still learning more about this, but it does remind me of back when I was first engaged by the American Telemedicine Association, and people were very skeptical about telehealth, telemedicine. Payers did not want to pay for it. And one of the first things that we did at the standards committee level, it was about a 2-3 year process, is really create a framework for telemedicine. And now, of course, today, post-pandemic, it's a core health benefit. So I think we're probably on the same kind of journey here with the remote scanning. Thanks, Dr. Siegel.
Sure. There's a QR code here. Is that code for folks who are itching to participate in the RadSite survey, I'm assuming?
Yes, that's correct. So scan that code in if you are involved with the remote scanning program and would like to weigh in on, it's a lot of questions. We're still trying to get us, and we'll release the study later this fall to just basically further effectuate more public policy discussion on these issues.
Okay, great. Thanks. Next slide. So, I guess one really key question is why remote scanning accreditation? It's required for reimbursement by CMS with accreditation in general. MIPA accreditation is required for reimbursement from CMS and the payers at this point. But why remote scanning accreditation? What are some of the advantages? Because that accreditation at this point doesn't exist. And so what is the goal? What are some of the advantages to, I guess, patients from an accreditation perspective and providers as well?
Dr. Siegel, you asked a good question. I think that here again, the key thing with scanning is the people affected. And in our common quest to achieve the very best for the patients we scan, knowing what needs to be done as defined by industry experts and as assessed by third-party objective assessors, I think that really helps us, achieve the best. When you have standards, you know what to aspire to. And so standards really let you know what to aspire to. And having accreditation really gives you a framework or a process within which you can implement remote scanning protocols, really taking the best from what other people have done, throughout the world, defined by leading industry experts. And it really gives you that advantage. I think, as you intimated, Dr. Siegel, it appeals really to regulators and to payers. So it really blazes a path to ultimate recognition by those two parties. I would also contend that, accreditation allows you to optimize and standardize your clinical workflows. And finally, really fundamentally, remote scanning addresses all those, concerns with respect to how patients will fit in and how their safety will be preserved and the quality of their imaging will be preserved.
That's really helpful. And so in many ways, the accreditation standards serve as a template for a variety of different organizations to be able to utilize as they end up setting up a safe, efficacious, and efficient program for doing remote scanning.
Exactly, a template, or I would say even a map. I mean, this is uncharted territory. And so it's a map of a to-do list of things that a facility needs to do or to assure to make sure they get to the ultimate goal of quality and safety.
Thanks, Garry. How about from your perspective?
Yeah, it's one of the things that we've noticed with the, and I'll talk on the next slide about the policy of implements. We've been looking at remote scanning programs for 3 years, and we've noticed a great deal of variability. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but just shows kind of we're an innovative.
Variability in templates or variability in prep?
Yeah, just in terms of the practices and the scope and the specifics. And I mentioned, the very first accreditation program that I brought to market was for PPOs. Back in the early 1990s, we had moved from indemnity insurance to HMOs to these things called point of service plans, and kind of predated regulation. So we worked with the major payer and some blue systems to create the first PPO standard for the country, and some other Christian bodies followed. And that really did create the template or the framework, and then state regulation followed. I think a big thing right now is that you don't have a whole lot of regulatory oversight that's specific or specific payer requirements. So we're kind of starting, again, as you'll hear in a moment, really we're hitting all the different buckets that relate to remote scanning program in a degree of detail that I don't think people have talked about. In fact, as we've been developing the standards, we started again almost 4 years ago in the fall of 2020. And now, this accreditation effort now, it's been a year-long effort. We had a remote scanning work group that worked in conjunction with the Remote Standards Committee. So a lot of thought and debate has gone into this. And of course, we'll continue updating and refining it as more people kind of grab onto the concept. So I do think that accreditation sometimes can be a market leader and really help create the process and structures that are key to a healthcare service like this.
Do you think remote scanning should just be a part of the general accreditation process that we have for modalities, including MR and CT? Or, why a separate accreditation for remote scanning that would be something that would be separate from the process? Would this not get rolled into accreditation in general, or is there incremental value for a separate accreditation for remote scanning?
Yeah, so now it's probably going to have to be separate. I mean, it can be considered a module when you look at telemedicine, telehealth programs, and how it links up with the managed care space with URAC and NCQA. You'll see they're separate programs, and that's, I think, just because of the volume of what's going on. Each accreditation, process can only cover so much. So this does represent, although, for example, one of the things that RadSite is going to require that you're already RadSite CT and or MRI accredited to qualify for this remote scanning program. So we're assuming you already are in compliance with the core standards. I mean, certainly things may shift and change over time, but I think it's a starting point where the goal here is to ramp it up to, a full accreditation program with a third-party self-assessment. Third-party assessment.
And RadSite is offering this to the facilities that are accredited by RadSite, but not those that are accredited by other accreditation organizations. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's possible down the road. RadSite has a lot of specific standards that are payer-specific, private payer-specific. So we take a great deal to customize our standards reflective of the other payers out there beyond CMS. So what we would have to do is we'd have to, if we recognize the ACR accreditation or IC or Joint Commission, we have to do a map to get those missing elements that are included in our standards or are not covered in our the other recognized accreditation organizations under MIPA. So we're open to it, but I think to start off, we're just going to recognize those that are RadSite accredited.
Understood. Thanks. Next slide, please. So, Garry, could you maybe continue a little bit and talk about the RadSite remote scanning policies and maybe provide a little bit of history of where that went? You alluded to that already, but maybe just give us a little bit of detail about how this has evolved, the remote scanning policy has evolved.
It's funny, sometimes ignorance is bliss, right? So we developed this standard, this policy in the fall of 2020, that being the RadSite Standards Committee, after we saw a number of our accredited companies switching over and they're actively engaging in remote scanning activities. And pursuant to Dr. Hiatt's point, we felt compelled to actually make sure we do begin to look at it because of patient safety issues and just the variability. So we actually finalized the first draft of it. And I guess, the kind of takeaway is that We're building upon this policy. We're not doing any part of it. So if anybody wants to hear more about the policy that's in effect today, I'm happy to meet with you offline to talk about that. But the RadSite board approved it in the winter of 2021, and then we sent it to CMS for review, and that took 3 or 4 months, and finally they approved in the summer of 2021. So in the fall of 2021, we added it to the existing accreditation process. So you're asked if you do remote scanning, you report some information on it, you have to read this policy, you have to attest to it. And then what we've been doing is we actually been doing virtual audits or on-site audits. In fact, Dr. Siegel and I went on the first one after we received a regulatory complaint. And so we have been following up, but I think what this accreditation standards does is really take it to the next level, and again offers a lot more detail. But I'm proud of the fact that RadSite for the past 3 years has been looking at this and actually taking information about what's been going on to hopefully promote better practices and better clinical outcomes at the end of the day, to ensure that the patient safety is not compromised, and also all these other principles that have led to moving to remote scanning, much like why we've moved to telehealth and telemedicine platforms.
And I probably should have asked you this question already, Dr. Hiatt, but what is remote scanning exactly? I mean, we've been talking around that. What exactly are some of the key concepts associated from your perspective, or what do we mean when we're talking about remote scanning, just as a high level concept, and maybe we can drill down a little bit.
Yeah, so the convention is that you've got everyone co-located at the place where the patient is.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got the scanner, you've got the patient being scanned.
Yep.
Inside that room, in the nearby room, you've got the technologist, either CT or MRI.
And potentially technologist assistants also. So there could be technologist assistants or aides also in the traditional conventional model, all essentially within the CT or MR scanning suite.
Exactly. And those assistants that you're referring to, as help with, patient movement, placement. In some cases, when intravenous contrast material is administered, they'll start the IV and just assure the patient's comfort, convenience, safety. And then you'll have also co-located is the interpreting radiologist, supervising, overseeing the whole procedure. You may have a medical director at the site. So everything is there in one place.
Mm-hmm.
That's the convention. The new approach, and facilitated by some of the trends that we've discussed, including technological, is where you can actually have a technologist operating the machine from afar.
Mm-hmm.
Not just from a few feet away in that adjacent room, but maybe in the next room in the same facility, maybe at the hospital, maybe in the next city, maybe across the country. And then similarly, you can have the radiologist interpreting and supervising also remotely. So you have the originating site and then the distant site in remote scanning.
Thanks. And is it your impression that in general, for remote technologists, that they're located in an office location that is set up by the facilities? Are they at home, like many radiologists are doing reading at home? Or do they actually kind of come into work in an office where they have a location that's already set up for them specifically to do remote scanning? Garry mentioned that, we did an audit, but that was really just the one. Are you aware of whether the trend for remote is actually to come to an office that's designated for remote technology scanning?
I think currently the convention is that there be a centralized place to which technologists come, as opposed to in their homes. Now, in my practice, most recently in the clinical setting, my colleague radiologists, some of them would do their reading from the comfort of their home because the technology would accommodate that. But I think in most cases, the technologists are still going to a center where all the extensive equipment could be set up and maintained. And in very few instances is that able to be achieved in people's personal homes. And I think also as a part of this, I think a lot of technologists like, as part of their week, to have some contact with the clinical setting, with the patients. And so a lot of them actually prefer not to be secluded 5 days a week in that centralized place, a sterile room with machines, but rather to have some contact with patients. And so some of them may go in, one day out of the week, achieve that.
And Dr. Siegel, I do, pursuant to Dr. Hiatt's observations, I do think that the home office technologist is a growing trend that's beginning to occur. And in fact, I think this may have been talked about. RadSite sponsored a webinar in June that featured 2 of the large imaging suppliers. And I would encourage those folks who have not heard that webinar to go to our website, our YouTube page, and listen to that. So that's featuring more what 2 large imaging suppliers are doing. But the way the standards are drafted, it does anticipate, it does factor in both types of scenarios, whether it's an imaging center that the remote technologists are working from, or actually as a distance site, or actually their home office, and making sure that, for example, that home office is HIPAA compliant and there's the base, the equipment's there so they can effectively do their job.
Thanks. And I would imagine that virtually all remote scanning is with CT and MRI, and very, very little with other modalities with regard to a technologist remotely operating a scanning console. And then as far as staff goes, typically what is remote is an experienced technologist, and then that is supplemented by other staff members that are in suite that could be a variety of personnel, and we'll talk about that. And then we talk about, the location being the originating site, on site with the patient, and then the distant site. So next slide, please. And so I think what we want to do is just go over a little bit for those of you who have questions about what are the components of the standards themselves. And they include the definition that we talked about a little bit of remote scanning. What are the requirements from an administrative perspective? And then really importantly and interestingly, what are requirements for professional staff, both for the remote technologist and also the folks who are on site with the patient, and professional staff, including not only technologist staff, but also physician staff. What are some of the operational requirements and the clinical and quality requirements? And I'm particularly interested and focused on quality requirements and safety requirements, as Dr. Hiatt had mentioned also. Next slide, please.
And just real quickly, Dr.
Sure.
It's my impression that there's been a lot of focus on MRI remote scanning and not as much focus on CT remote scanning. And so it's interesting. So I do think that the professional staff requirements, both in terms of responsibilities and qualifications, actually carve out important territory with the CT, and then also maybe more detail in the MRI. But I think also the work group in the standards committee spent a lot of time talking about, okay, what does it mean, beyond the 501(k) FDA approval, to actually have an operational framework that works, and then also, to have a clinical and quality platform where, for example, caseloads are appropriate and things like that. So we're excited about being able to share that with you in a minute. So,
and Garry, so you believe that there will be many more applications for MRI for accreditation for remote scanning rather than CT from the trends that you're seeing recently in the current practice. Is that correct?
Well, for now, I think that, one of the impetus really to get MRI remote scanning going was the MRI tech shortage, which was severe in many jurisdictions. But that's also, I think one factor that, we have to consider for CT is that you're talking about ionizing radiation. So there are a few states, for example, I believe potentially California and Colorado, that do not allow CT remote scanning. So I think generally speaking, people need to be more conservative in terms of CT remote scanning, but similar to my experience with telemedicine, I'm pretty sure that it will continue to gain traction. It'll be more accepted over the years to come, as long as the basic protocols are put in place to, make sure the equipment's operated appropriately by a licensed technologist, and then, making sure the patient is, safe and the exam's optimized for clinical fidelity.
And when you say more conservative, you mean more specifically checking into the local state requirements?
Yeah, in all situations, if a state has, or federal government has a regulation that's more prescriptive, RadSite will defer to that. But of course, what RadSite's doing here is doing some major gap filling, because in most of the things we're going to talk about today, states are silent, and so are payers. So what we're trying to do is really create the first comprehensive framework that really treats it, more holistically. Now, you could look at this accreditation program and just address it to MRI. It doesn't mandate CT, but what we do mandate is that if you have a remote scanning location, all your imaging equipment that are associated with remote scanning covering CT and MRI must be included. But I think most of our applicants will probably just be related to MRI at this point. But I do think some CT remote scanning programs are out there as well.
Okay, thanks. And just to highlight, at this point, you're not aware of any other accreditation that exists currently for remote scanning. Is that correct?
No, but I do know that our sister accreditation organizations are developing potentially policies and similar activities. So I would assume, we, as you know, Dr. Siegel and Dr. Hiatt, we've been talking about this remote scanning on the quarterly calls with the CMS, with the other accreditation organizations, and we're hoping that we can engage the payers. I think it's important that we have shared public policy discussions on this. So I assume once we launch this version, it'll be another 6 months before we're doing version 1.1 because of what other people are doing. So I think this is too important for any one organization. But to answer your question, I do think we're really going to be first out of the gate, as we already are. I mean, we started looking at this in the fall of 2021. So we've been doing this for 3 years. We're just racking it up to a full accreditation program.
So could you maybe just give us a really brief overview of the administrative requirements portion of this accreditation?
Yeah, so most accreditation programs, whether it's provider-based, managed care, residential, basically wants to get to the kind of organizational aspects of the program or the focus of the accreditation program. So obviously, in this case, we want to make sure there's some corporate awareness of what's going on at an imaging supplier that has this. So we like to see some authorization. It can be done through the medical director or through a board or a senior clinical leadership team, making sure, pursuant to the discussion we just had, that the scope is defined, talking about really what is the remote scanning program, what modalities are involved, what are all the, in addition to the originating sites, the distant sites identified, what are the division of the different roles between staff. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And just really making sure there's a process in place to identify the different types of clinical protocols and scanning procedures that are included and excluded in a remote scanning program. And then, of course, just making sure there's written policy and procedures, as any good organization will do, and make sure there's a process to update those policies and procedures, and there's training on those policy and procedures. And then, much like telemedicine, where there's actually, you have patient consent for healthcare, you also have patient consent for the telemedicine transaction. So part of this is to make sure the patient is educated and there's disclosure, and the patient understands exactly where the scanning technologist is, whether in their building or in their home office, and that they know how to communicate if they need to that remote scanning technologist. So it's disclosure to the patient. And then, as we just mentioned, in terms of regulatory compliance, so RadSite will begin to work with other organizations to do 50 state surveys, and we need to work with the regulators. We'll share our model, standards with the regulators to hopefully provide some guidance to them. But I think I anticipate with all the other 29 accreditation programs I've brought to market, there'll be more regulations that will kind of hopefully be synchronized with what we're doing, and also potentially with the other accreditation organizations down the line. But again, if a state has a more restrictive standard, you have to comply with that. If RadSite has a more restrictive standard, you have to comply with us. So
how would somebody in a particular state do some research to find out what those requirements might be for their particular state? What would be the best person or entity to contact?
Well, a lot of, as we all know, CT is regulated in most states, and components of MRI are regulated in the state. So obviously contact the state regulator. Some of the professional organizations track regulations, and I think it is very important to actually make sure you are contacting regulators and to make sure that you're complying with what the requirements are. So I do think this is a little bit of an educational give and take. because a lot of this is innovative and has not been captured. As we, I'm a lawyer, so obviously states pass a law through their state legislative body, and then that's authorized as an agency to promulgate additional regulations that can be formally published or sometimes informal, and sometimes embedded into local city or local ordinances as well. So it's really important to make sure you do have a risk management program in place to make sure you're complying with all the state regulatory requirements.
Thanks. Next slide, please. So one thing I know there's been a tremendous amount of discussion about has been, what really are the professional staff requirements? And so, Mark, you want to talk about that a little bit? What are within the standard in section 2, what are the relative roles of these people or the personnel specifically who are doing remote scanning?
Yeah, Dr. Siegel, we talked a little bit about this. To produce a quality scan safely, it really takes a team. And there are many different players. We alluded to them before, but what we do in the standards is really identify what the necessary standards are with respect to education, training, licensure, certification, roles, responsibilities, duties, and performance. Everyone plays their part on this team, including the medical director at the site, responsible for overall policies and procedures, the specific supervising physician overseeing the scan at hand, the scanning technologist, and the in-suite on-site personnel who assist.
And then how about the other roles? There's what do we mean by in-suite aid? And that we have for MR and CT. What is the relative role of an aid, and what might be the qualifications for an aid?
Yeah, so all these need to be specified in the standards. That the person on according to, for example, in the administration of IV, that needs to be done in the suite, obviously in person. It can't be done remotely. In fact, it's specified that IV contrast can't be initiated remotely, but it's specified that these aids act within their licensure to initiate that. That they act within the scope of their state licensure. And so all of that is outlined, and also specifics with respect to their necessary education and training to administer that contrast material.
Right. So go ahead, Garry.
Yeah, I think I can chime a little bit. So
sure.
So there are basically two potential types of in-suite positions for each modality. So basically, the in-suite licensed personnel, CT, in-suite certified personnel, is someone who has some sort of tech credentials or training. And you can see our standards and see how we kind of back into that. Not every state has the licensing for MRI, for example. That's why we call it certified. But they're going to have to, so they're the ones who, in conjunction with the remote scanning technologists, can help operate the machine. The in-suite aid, whether CT or MRI, cannot operate the machine, and really is there, and that's not kind of an optional position. On the one hand, the in-suite licensed personnel or certified personnel can bring the patient in, position them, educate them, and do all that. But it's also the possibility where they could also be working with an in-suite aid that does the patient education and position the patient. So it's kind of a two-team. So, but there is a distinction. The in-suite aid really, and the qualifications therefore are a little less than what they are for the in-suite licensed personnel. But RadSite does detail specific, requirements in terms of how they can be qualified for the job. And then, it's important to note that the training for all in-suite staff includes, training modality, terminology, patient safety, BLS, ACLS, all the different, making sure they really understand. And obviously, for example, for MRI, you're going to need level 2 training for any in-suite staff that are in the facility. So it goes into, that's actually the bulk, as you saw by the table of contents of our standards. And that's really what we spent a lot of time carefully crafting, just to make sure we do define those roles pursuant to Dr. Hyatt's point in terms of a team approach, because ultimately they are co-located with the patient and often the imaging council.
So the medical director at her or his discretion have the ability to specify that you can have a more experienced technologist in a modality supervising a less experienced technologist in that modality, or a more experienced technologist in a modality supervising a tech who is not working in that modality, or at the discretion of the medical director, one could have a remote technologist who is experienced, who is supervising an aide who is not a technologist and does not have the privilege to operate the scanning console, which would all be operated in all instances if there were an aide in the suite by the remote experienced technologist. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. And so as far as operational requirements, there are quite a few. There are requirements related to technology. And so, what are some of the technology issues? One needs to be able to have audio and also visual contact between the remote technologist and the person who is in the suite, who is with the patient. And so the technology has requirements for a level of security, a level of redundancy, and goes into some specific details about which of the personnel are able to communicate with each other and with the patient as well. There's requirements in-site, and then there are requirements for what is required at the distance site. And as we mentioned earlier, many of the vendors provide equipment in support for both within the scanning suite and at the distant site as well. But there are practices that have created their own equipment for that, and that could certainly meet accreditation requirements. There's requirements for communication with personnel, and that it needs to be open and contemporaneous during the entire scan. Requirements related to connectivity, which must be maintained during the course of the study, and backups and what to do in case that connectivity is interrupted. And of course, what's paramount is considerations related to privacy and security for the patients, and standards that address that. And I think these are all really absolutely essential for efficacious and safe operation for patients. And one of the reasons why I think it's so important to have these remote standards in the first place. Next, please.
And Dr. Siegel?
Yes.
Before you brought up the brilliant analogy of how these standards are like a template or even a map.
Yes.
They aren't so much meant to be restrictive, cumbersome. They aren't meant to be constraints, but rather a helpful map, where otherwise you may not think that you need to have redundancy or means to assure privacy and security. So really, these give you a point-by-point map in these standards of how really to go about implementing remote scanning safely and effectively.
Yeah, thanks for underscoring that. And also, I want to emphasize that there's not one particular technical solution. There could be a wide variety of technical solutions that would allow the functionality that would be required for safe and efficacious operation as well. So thanks. Next slide. And then with regard to clinical and quality requirements, I mean, this is really a favorite and really important point from my perspective. I'm going to be really fascinated as we end up getting data from a variety of different programs about the impact of remote scanning. What is the impact related to patient satisfaction, impact related to repeat rates or quality of examinations? Are there any changes that are documented with regard to scanning time? Are programs able to have more sophisticated types of studies and scans done, such as cardiac imaging, for example, when they're doing remote scanning? What are the perceived impact on the technologists? And is there any information that's being gathered from patients who are all being told that they are being scanned remotely as is required, or there is a technologist who is doing the scanning remotely as is required by the standards. And then there's the fascinating question of caseloads. We leave caseload determination up to the medical director, but what are issues related to caseloads that are being done? What are typical ones, and what are the cognitive limitations of a human being regarding how many studies can be performed within a particular time, or how many studies for MRI, for example, can be done contemporaneously. And so for CT, the scanning is very rapid, and so it would be sequential and is required to be sequential, but one could have more than one MR study being done contemporaneously and be compliant with the standard. And so collecting data there will be interesting. And to me, what's really critical is that accreditation organizations such as RadSite create a culture of continuous quality feedback, where each one of the facilities or each one of the programs essentially collects their data and analyzes it, and then the medical director ends up utilizing that data to continue to improve and refine the programs. It's been suggested in the literature that remote scanning may improve quality of scans for patients, may provide a higher level of expertise, and may significantly increase operational efficiency, while decreasing the issues related to the technologist shortage. But it's going to be really important to have data-driven information and to be able to confirm that. So I think, these clinical and quality requirements for me are really the most important of all the different sections. Next, please. So as far as wrapping up, Garry, you want to talk a little bit about how the standards are being finalized, the timelines, and any updates you'd like to give?
We do have a couple of questions if we've
Okay.
got time for that.
Okay,
Yeah,
let me just quickly give a sorry.
And we do have time, yes.
So real quickly, the RadSite board, the standards committee approved the draft remote scanning standards in early August, late July, and then the board approved it in August. So we're now working with CMS, and we'll be reaching out to some other stakeholders to provide feedback. So to be honest with you, we're 4 or 5 months behind schedule. That's because it's just important to get this right. It's too important. So we have made, we continue tweaking. I'm sure we'll have some feedback. So my hope at this point is to be able to launch this program either in December or January. And so during the fall, in addition to the feedback from the third-party groups, we'll also be doing some beta testing. And if you're interested in having a one-on-one info session or actually seeing the standards, reach out to RadSite at the following email address, info@radsitequality.com, and we'll reach out to you. Because obviously this webinar has gone through at maybe the 10,000 foot level, and I'm sure many of you would like to actually see the specific standards. And then we will be offering a follow-up webinar probably in December or January, actually going through the accreditation review process. So our commitment is to still maintain transparency. But once we get the feedback, it has to go back to the RadSite Standards Committee, and we'll also include the remote scanning work group that met for a year, and then back to the board. So I'm hoping we'll get this dropped in the next couple months, but it's been a journey, and I'm proud of the work. And RadSite's running on a volunteer basis, so we just had some amazing people put in a lot of time to help with us. So I just want to acknowledge and thank their participation.
Excellent. And this webinar recording is going to be available so people can share it and watch it again as soon as when?
Within probably a day or two. We'll have it posted on our website and on our RadSite YouTube page.
Excellent. Great. Thanks. So you mentioned there were some questions. That's great.
Yeah. So the first one is going to personnel staffing. The MRI in-suite certified personnel could only be an aide trained in level 2 MRI and not an MRI technologist if the medical director is okay with that.
Garry?
Well, if I understand the question, we do have about 10 elements that make up the training criteria for both the in-suite MRI certified personnel and the in-suite aides. So they are fully trained because obviously they're in a very protected area.
So there is discussion, has been extensive discussion about the detailed requirements for education and training for those in-suite aides. And so the standard goes into a fair amount of detail specifying what types of training and background that they need in order to be able to qualify from the standards perspective for serving as an aide. The one thing that they're not able to do according to the standard is actually operate the console, which requires a technologist. But other than that, they're fairly extensive training requirements for that inside aide. So thanks, that's a great question. And that was that we really struggled with. And there were lots of opinions from the expert members of the committee to arrive at some of those specific recommendations. And we're always looking for people's thoughts. So it'd be great if you all on the webinar are able to take a look at the standard and some of those and give us some feedback.
Wonderful.
And there
also, there's another question. Yeah, can the medical director and supervising physician be the same?
Yes, absolutely. So really depending on the size of the practice, there's some really huge practices where you might have one medical director for many different facilities. You might have one medical director for a single facility with many physicians. And so there might be one supervisor for one facility where there could be 10 radiologists, for example, and for any particular scan, there would be one radiologist who would be responsible for answering any questions if the technologist, the remote technologist had any questions or issues that she or he had. So absolutely, the medical director could definitely be a supervising physician. Any working medical director radiologist is probably going to be supervising a subset of examinations. So absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Let's see. Will the remote scanning accreditation be module specific? Example, cardiac MRI, or does it cover the specific modules noted on the facility's MRI accreditation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the remote accreditation would cut across all of the different modules. So it would apply for cardiac MR, for example, as it would apply for other MR types of studies. And so it's not specific to modules. And that's, I think, part of the reason that it's helpful that it's a standalone. And so it really just looks at the aspects related to the conduct of the remote scanning and what's specific about it being remote. And so it really, once a facility has that accreditation and recognition, it would apply for all of the modules. And Garry, it would apply for all of the scanners of that particular modality at that particular facility. Is that right?
Right, correct.
Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. I do want to ask one last question in regards to the IV contrast. How does the administration of IV contrast work in a remote scanning program?
Mark, you want to take that on?
Yeah, so the initiation of that administration could not be done remotely. Rather, you have the on-site in-suite attendants properly qualified and credentialed to do so. And they would do that according, if applicable, according to their state licensure.
And so the requirements wouldn't change given the fact that there's remote scanning. There would need to be personnel on site, just as there would be in a non-remote situation, that would be fully able to and credentialed to administer intravenous contrast. And the personnel who would be there required to be able to respond to any adverse event associated with an imaging study.
And just a quick additional point, RadSite does follow the federal regulations on that. And so you do need to be within the scope of your practice, whether you're a technologist or a physician or a physician assistant. So you're going to have that personnel on site. And just as everybody's aware, the federal government has been given a waiver as part of the public health emergency for the physician to be remote, but to have an active link to supervise the IV contrast. So that would be incorporated in it. But we'll, obviously, again, we're going to track and require whatever the federal government and any additional more restrictive requirements coming from the states as relate to that standard.
So Mark and Garry, thank you so much for a fantastic discussion and all of your insights. I do believe that remote scanning is going to continue to advance and continue to be really incredibly impactful in so many different ways. I think it has the potential to increase safety, the potential to increase efficiency, the potential to decrease technologist burnout, and to allow us to be able to continue to provide, critically needed services to our patients where we might not be able to otherwise, and more advanced types of procedures. More and more people are doing cardiac imaging, for example, in sites that might not have been able to have had all of their technologists have that full level of expertise. So I think it's really exciting and impactful, and congratulations, RadSite, for being one of the early pioneers with this. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude the session. Anything else?
Yes, we would just like to thank our moderator, RadSite. I'd like to thank our moderator, Dr. Eliot Siegel, and our presenters, Dr. Mark Hiatt and Garry Carneal. If there's any additional questions, you can contact us at info@radsitequality.com. And if you did ask a question and we were not able to get to it, we will get back to you with that answer. And just a reminder that today's webinar has been recorded and will be available through our website. If you enjoyed this presentation, be sure to check out the webinar page on our website and RadSite's YouTube channel for past recordings. And we'd like to thank you very much for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you in future webinars. Thank you.